The fluorescent lights hum. That's the first thing Margaret Walsh notices when she pushes through the staff entrance at Sacred Heart Hospital in Portland, not the antiseptic smell or the distant sound of monitors beeping, but the low electrical hum of lights that never sleep. She's been hearing it for 3 weeks now, ever since she took this job. 3 weeks of night shifts. 3 weeks of watching. 3 weeks of reading charts that don't add up. Her badge clips to her scrubs with a soft metallic sound. The name reads Margaret Walsh, RN. It's not the name she was born with, but it's the one that matters now. Everything before Sacred Heart belongs to classified files buried in Pentagon servers, sealed and redacted, filed under operations that officially never existed. The pediatric wing is quieter at night. Softer somehow, even though nothing has actually changed except the people in the hallway have fewer eyes on them. Margaret moves past rooms where children sleep under the watchful glow of nightlights and monitors. Room for 12 is at the far end of the corridor. She pauses outside the door, reading the chart mounted on the wall before she steps inside. Emma. Age 10. 4-star general's daughter. Paralyzed from TIA downward for 2 years. 16 attempted treatments. 6 specialists who've written the same conclusion in nearly identical handwriting: degenerative spinal cord injury, prognosis poor, recommend palliative care. Margaret enters the room with a kind of quiet that comes from knowing how to move through spaces without announcing yourself. The girl is asleep, small beneath the white hospital blanket, her shoulders barely raising the fabric. Even in sleep, there's something wrong about the way Emma lies, too flat, too still, the stillness of someone whose body stopped listening 2 years ago. The chart in Margaret's hands is thicker than it should be for a 10-year-old. She stands at the foot of the bed, reading by the soft green glow of the bedside monitor. Her eyes move fast, too fast, cataloging information. Heart rate stable. Respiratory rate normal. O2 sat 98% on room air. Blood work from this morning shows nothing remarkable. But the billing codes. The billing codes are the problem. Margaret's hands are trembling. She can feel it, the slight vibration in her fingers as she turns the pages. She hasn't trembled in 16 years. Not since Marjah. Not since the night the compound caught fire and her hands had to stay steady while everything around her burned. But trembling is what people expect from the night nurse doing chart reviews at 2:44 a.m. Trembling is what a woman with dark circles under her eyes and a wedding ring she doesn't wear for any husband looks like when she's tired. Trembling is her cover. She makes a note in her pocket notebook, leather-bound, small enough to hide in a scrub pocket. The handwriting is precise, military school precise, letters formed with the kind of exactness that comes from years of field reports written by candlelight in forward operating bases. Experimental Protocol Code 4421B administered, 0 documented instances. Billed, $847,000. Treatment Code 7734X documented procedure time, 90 minutes. Actual nursing notes, none. Margaret closes the chart softly and steps back out into the hallway. The fluorescent lights continue their hum, indifferent to her discovery. Down the corridor, behind the frosted glass of the administrative office, a figure watches. Dr. Hargrove. Chief of Neurology. Billing Authority on Experimental Treatment Protocols. He sees her trembling hands first. The way her fingers adjust the chart with that slight shake. Dark circles under her eyes like she hasn't slept in a week. The way she moves with careful steps, not the confident stride of a seasoned nurse, but the uncertain gait of someone new, someone still learning the hospital's rhythms. He sees all of that. What he doesn't see is the surgical scar on her left wrist that pulls tight when she grips things, evidence of a field procedure performed without anesthesia in a place maps don't acknowledge. He doesn't see the faint white lines on her knuckles, marks of sutures tied with paracord and medical tape under conditions that would make a trauma surgeon's hands shake. He doesn't see the way her breathing is controlled, diaphragmatic, regulated at exactly 12 breaths per minute even during stress. The kind of breathing people learn in SEER training. The kind that keeps you alive when your body wants to shut down. Most of all, he doesn't see the pair of worn combat boots tucked behind her locker on the lower shelf, the leather creased at precise angles, the laces still tied in a knot taught to special warfare operators, secure, deliberate, fast to undo in an emergency. Boots that walked 37 miles across the Helmand province. Boots that stood in mud that was half sand and half blood. Boots that earned their scars in a place called Marjah, where the mountains breathed dust and the nights came alive with the sound of helicopters. Dr. Hargrove smiles. The new night nurse with the shaking hands and the meticulous chart reviews. She won't last a week. People like her, careful people, thorough people, the kind who make notations in pocket notebooks and read billing codes like they're puzzle pieces meant to fit together, people like that don't survive long in hospitals. Hospitals are places where everyone knows not to look too closely at the business side. Hospitals are places where profit and healing exist in separate columns on separate spreadsheets, never meant to intersect in the mind of a single nurse at 2:16 a.m. Margaret makes her way to the break room. It's empty at this hour, just a microwave and a refrigerator that hums in a slightly different key than the hallway lights. She sits at the table with her notebook and a cup of cold coffee that's been sitting since her shift started. The coffee tastes like she expected it to taste, like it's been sitting for 6 hours, like it's practicing being regret. She drinks it anyway. Waste nothing. Trust no one. That was always the operational framework. The chart from room for 12 sits in her memory now, not because of the billing codes, though those matter. What matters is the girl. Emma. 10 years old. Paralyzed. Suffering. The kind of case that brings out the fraud in people who are supposed to heal. Margaret has seen it before, in combat zones where supplies meant for wounded soldiers got redirected to black market dealers, in field hospitals where commanders looked the other way when corpsmen cut corners. The machinery of corruption doesn't change. It just wears different uniforms. At 3:14 a.m., the trauma alert comes through the hospital intercom. The voice is clipped, professional, the kind of voice that doesn't carry emotion because there isn't time for emotion. Motorcycle crash. Multiple lacerations. ETA for minutes. The break room empties. Margaret moves with everyone else, but slower, observing. That's what she does. She observes. She watches how people move under pressure. She reads the room like she reads charts. The trauma bay is controlled chaos. 6 people. Maybe 7. Dr. Hargrove isn't here yet, he's in his office, probably reviewing billing codes of his own, making sure his margins add up. The trauma attending is a woman named Dr. Chen, competent, sharp-eyed, the kind of doctor who actually looks at her patients instead of their insurance status. Margaret takes position at the suture station, preparing materials. Gloves. Sterile field. Instruments arranged in order of use. The patient arrives. Male, 30s, road rash covering most of his right side, a laceration above his left eye that needs proper closure. Margaret watches the doctors assess, listen to the trauma attending assign tasks. The wound above the eye is deep. It will need layered closure, dermal and epidermal, separate sutures to prevent scarring. Margaret picks up the needle driver and the first suture. Her hands stop trembling. They become steady. They become precise. They become the hands of someone who has sutured wounds in field conditions under fire, who has closed lacerations by headlamp with helicopters circling overhead, who has tied knots that held human skin together with nothing but training and muscle memory. The stitches go in. 7 of them. Even spacing. Perfect tension. The technique is automatic, something her hands remember even when her mind is somewhere else. Probably in Afghanistan. Probably in 2009. That's when someone freezes. The man standing across the trauma bay, tall, military bearing, the kind of build that comes from regular PT and discipline, stops moving. His eyes lock on Margaret's hands. On the specific way her fingers angle the needle driver. On the angle of insertion. On the spacing between stitches. On the kind of suture technique that isn't taught in civilian nursing schools. That's taught at JSOC courses. At Fort Bragg. At places that don't appear in hospital training materials. His combat medic. Margaret can read it in the way he carries himself, the faded 75th Ranger Regiment tattoo on his forearm half covered by his sleeve. The kind of medic who's worked in environments where standard protocols don't apply, where you do what works with what you have in the time that's available. He knows. Just from watching her hands move. Margaret feels his stare. She doesn't look up. She doesn't change her technique. She ties off the last suture with the exact same precision, a surgical square knot, neat, professional, civilian. Completely unremarkable to anyone who isn't trained to see what she's doing. She sets down the needle driver and meets his eyes for exactly 1 second. In that second, she gives him a subtle headshake. Barely perceptible. The kind of movement that could be a minor involuntary response, a muscle twitch, meaningless. The medic blinks. His jaw tightens. He nods, so slight it's almost invisible, and looks away. He returns to his task, whatever it was before he froze. He doesn't speak. He doesn't approach her. He doesn't ask questions. That's how people in certain lines of work recognize each other. Not with words. With silence. Margaret finishes the wound closure at 3:02 a.m. The patient is stable. The trauma attending thanks her for the quality of the sutures. Margaret nods and says nothing. By 4:15 a.m., she's back in the pediatric wing, back to her charts, back to her observations. She passes room for 12 and pauses again. Emma is still asleep, still paralyzed, still trapped in a body that won't respond to the signals her brain sends down the spinal cord. Margaret's left hand touches the wall, and she can feel the slight irregularity of the plaster where someone has patched and painted over damage. Everything in a hospital is like that, patched and painted, trying to look functional while the foundation underneath is compromised. What happened next didn't just change Margaret's shift. It changed the trajectory of everyone in Sacred Heart Hospital. Monday morning arrived with fluorescent brightness and the smell of burnt coffee lingering in the break room at Sacred Heart Hospital. Margaret stood by the coffee machine, watching the dark liquid drip into a ceramic pot older than most of the residents. The room filled gradually, nurses finishing night shift, day staff arriving early, residents grabbing caffeine before rounds. She kept her hands wrapped around her mug, the warmth grounding her while her eyes moved across a patient chart she'd memorized 16 hours ago. Dr. Hargrove entered like he owned the room. He probably thought he did. His tailored suit cost more than Margaret's monthly rent. His watch gleamed under the lights, stainless steel and arrogance. He pulled out his wallet with theatrical precision and raised his voice to cut through the morning noise. "I'm making a public wager," he announced, spreading a $100 bill across the break room table. Laughter rippled through the group like electricity. $100 says our newest night nurse quits by Friday. Anyone want to take that action? Several residents chuckled nervously. A charge nurse smiled in that uncomfortable way people do when they don't want to offend but also don't want to miss the joke. Margaret didn't look up from her chart. She'd been called worse by better men. Men who'd actually been tested. Men who'd faced consequences beyond a hospital administration review. No takers? Hargrove's voice carried the satisfied edge of someone accustomed to winning without resistance. He folded the bill back into his wallet. "I suppose you all know something I don't." The group dispersed. Margaret finished her coffee in measured sips, each one deliberate, each one a small act of control. She'd learned control in places that no longer officially existed. In valleys where the wrong breath at the wrong moment cost lives. In field hospitals where you didn't have the luxury of falling apart because 7 people were depending on your hands to keep them breathing. By Tuesday, the wager had become hospital currency. Staff members referenced it in passing. Margaret heard it twice in the elevator, once in the supply closet, once outside the ICU. The bet had created a deadline, a countdown, a narrative where her failure was not just possible but profitable. She was carrying her lunch tray through the cafeteria at 1,245 hours when she saw him sitting at a table with two pharmaceutical representatives. The tray held a sandwich, a cup of soup, a small salad. Nothing elaborate. Margaret had learned to eat efficiently, without attachment. Food was fuel. Lunch was a 20-minute maintenance cycle, nothing more. Hargrove's foot extended into her path with the casual cruelty of a man who'd never experienced consequence. The tray went down like a small building collapsing. Soup splashed across the tile floor in a pattern that looked like blood spray. The sandwich slid under a nearby table. Silverware clattered against the hard surface. "Clumsy, aren't we, sweetheart?" His voice carried the tone of a man commenting on the weather. He dropped a patient chart, Emma Walsh's file. Margaret's mind registered, directly at her feet. "Pick that up." The cafeteria seemed to compress into a single moment. Conversations paused. People's eyes flickered in her direction, then away, the way witnesses turn from car accidents they don't want to remember. Margaret knelt slowly, feeling the cold tile against her knees, feeling the weight of every person pretending not to watch. One tear escaped. She didn't know it would happen, didn't feel it coming, but there it was, running down her cheek like a malfunction in a machine she'd spent 15 years maintaining without error. She wiped it without breaking eye contact with Hargrove. Her hands gathered the patient chart pages with the same precision she would use assembling field dressings in the dark. Every page. Every corner. Systematic. Clean. Standing, she held the file against her chest and spoke in a voice like still water, the kind of water that goes deep, that never shows its currents, that can hold anything below the surface. "I've carried heavier things than your insecurities, Doctor." The room exhaled. Hargrove's expression flickered, just for a fraction of a second, the way a predator pauses when it realizes the prey has teeth. Then his face hardened back into that practiced expression of superiority. He turned back to his pharmaceutical representatives as if Margaret had already ceased to exist. She walked out of the cafeteria without looking back. The tray could stay on the floor. The soup could dry into the tile. Margaret had learned long ago that sometimes you have to leave the wreckage behind and focus on the patient waiting in the next room. Wednesday night found her in the nursing station, the fluorescent lights humming their electric lullaby, the ward quiet in that particular way hospitals became at 0230 hours. She had Emma's file open on the desk. The numbers didn't match. They never did, once you knew what to look for. Experimental immunotherapy treatments billed at $42,000 per session, medications that didn't exist in the hospital pharmacy. Neural regeneration protocols referenced in the billing codes but absent from the actual medical record. Nothing ordered. Nothing administered. Nothing except the slow erosion of a child's future and a general's hope, while an account somewhere received deposits that explained Dr. Hargrove's $6,000 watch. His voice came before she heard his footsteps. The hospital was quiet enough that even careful movement registered as vibration in the floor. "You seem very interested in things that aren't your concern, Walsh." Hargrove stood beside the desk, close enough that Margaret could smell his aftershave, something expensive and aggressive. That's a dangerous habit for someone so replaceable. He left the file open on the desk between them. His message was unmistakable. He knew she knew. He knew she was documenting. And he wanted her to understand the futility of it all. Margaret's hands wanted to shake. She held them steady, moved them slowly, photographed 3 pages with her hospital phone. Each image was a small rebellion, a brick in a wall she couldn't yet see but could feel taking shape in the distance. Hargrove disappeared into the darkness of the ward like smoke. That evening, her phone buzzed with a message from the staffing office. She was scheduled for Thursday night, which meant she would work the hospital's busiest shift. Hargrove always worked Thursday nights. Of course he did. But what happened Thursday evening didn't come from Hargrove's strategy. It came from the universe running on its own terrible timeline. Friday morning arrived like a closing fist. Margaret stood outside Dr. Hargrove's office at 7:15, before the hospital woke, holding a manila folder that contained the evidence of 3 nights of careful chart review. The folder was thin but heavy. Inside were 19 pages of printouts. Billing codes cross-referenced against treatment logs. Experimental neural stimulation protocols that appeared on invoices dated September through November but nowhere in Emma's actual medical record. Doses of medications charged but never dispensed. Sessions logged for treatments that had no corresponding notes in the nursing documentation. The fluorescent hallway hummed its electric drone. Early morning was Margaret's favorite time at Sacred Heart, before the machinery of the day kicked into full operation, when the hospital still felt like a place where people healed instead of a place where money changed hands. She had learned to work in silence. Now she carried proof that someone had weaponized that silence. She knocked. 3 sharp raps. "Come in." Hargrove sat behind a mahogany desk that belonged in a country club, not a neurology department. Morning light cut through the windows behind him, making him backlit, a silhouette with a coffee mug in one hand. He was reading something on his monitor, glasses perched halfway down his nose. He didn't look up. "Walsh. You're early. I wanted to speak with you privately, Doctor." Her voice was steady, careful. The careful voice she'd been using for 8 days, the voice that said nothing, the voice of a woman who knew her place. About Emma's treatment protocol. That made him look up. His eyes moved from her face to the folder, then back to her face. Something flickered across his expression. Not concern. Calculation. "Come in. Close the door." She did both. The office door sealed with a soft click. The world outside the glass suddenly felt very far away. Margaret placed the folder on his desk and remained standing. A power move. She knew it was a power move. She'd learned about power in places where power was measured in altitude and distance and the number of seconds it took for a target to fall. Hargrove opened the folder with the confidence of a man who had never met a problem he couldn't talk his way out of. He had the face of that man, the tailored shirt and the $10,000 watch and the calluses on his right hand from a golf grip, not from work. He read the first page. His jaw tightened. "Dr. Hargrove." Margaret's voice came out like still water, like a lake you couldn't see the bottom of. "Emma's deterioration isn't because of her injury. It's because she's not receiving the therapies you're billing for. The neural stimulation protocol, it's listed on every invoice since September. But it's not in her medical record. It was never administered." He read the second page. The third. His left hand opened and closed. Opened and closed. "These charges total $487,000, Margaret continued. And the treatments don't exist in her chart. If we actually implement the protocols you've been billing for, the ones the general already paid for, if we start them now, there might still be time to see improvement in her motor function." Hargrove set the folder down with the deliberate precision of a man stacking explosives. When he looked at her, his eyes had changed. The professional mask was gone. What was left underneath was not anger. It was something worse. It was recognition. He had just realized that she knew. And that she had proof. "You've been here 8 days, he said quietly. His voice sounded like gravel being crushed under a boot. 8 days, and you're in my office telling me how to do my job. You're questioning my clinical decisions based on paperwork you don't understand." "I understand billing codes." Margaret didn't move. "I understand what it means when a treatment is charged but not documented." "You understand nothing." He stood. The chair rolled backward and hit the wall. "You walk in here, you put on scrubs like you belong somewhere, and you start digging through files that aren't your concern. You know what that makes you, Walsh? A liability. A problem." She met his eyes. Held them. "I think we need to talk about your employment future," he said. The words came out coated in something that looked like regret but wasn't. "But not now. Not here. Let me make some calls first. Background verification. References. I want to make sure I have all the information before we have that conversation." Margaret felt something shift in the room's pressure. The way it did before an operation, when the plan changed and everybody had to adapt in real time. "Of course, Doctor." She turned toward the door. Hargrove's voice stopped her. "Leave the folder." She placed it on his desk and left without answering. The hallway was still empty. The hospital was still sleeping. Margaret walked back toward the pediatric unit with the careful measured pace of a woman who had just watched someone calculate how to destroy her and had decided not to flinch. By the time she reached the nursing station, her hands had steadied. By the time she clocked in for her shift, she had already begun thinking 3 moves ahead. Hargrove made his first call at 7:45. Margaret knew this because the hospital operator, a woman named Dina with a daughter Margaret had helped through a difficult night shift, mentioned it casually when Margaret stopped by the main desk. "Dr. Hargrove's been making calls all morning. Something about background checks." The second call came at 8:30. The third at 9. By noon, Margaret had watched him make 6 phone calls from his office, each one lasting between 7 and 14 minutes. Board members, she guessed. The kind of men who owed him favors. The kind of institutional power that didn't require proof, just a suggestion. Just a whisper in the right ear. That afternoon, she was adjusting Emma's bed angle during one of the child's difficult episodes, the monitors alarming in their insistent way, oxygen saturation hovering at 88. Margaret moved with the efficiency of someone whose hands had performed this task 10,000 times, had performed worse tasks in worse conditions, had learned that panic was a luxury she couldn't afford. The ventilator wheezed its steady mechanical rhythm. The heart monitor beeped in a pattern that was concerning but not yet catastrophic. "The other nurses gave up on me," Emma whispered, her small voice almost buried under the sound of machines. "Why didn't you?" Margaret adjusted the oxygen flow, checked the settings on the monitor, held the small hand between both of hers. The child's skin was warm. Her grip was surprisingly strong. "I don't know how to give up, sweetheart." Emma's eyes closed. The monitor settled into a steadier rhythm. Margaret remained at the bedside, her presence something like an anchor, something like a shield, something like the only thing standing between this child and the machinery designed to keep her alive but not to save her. The rain started around 3 in the afternoon, just a light patter at first, then building into something heavier. By the time Margaret's shift ended at 7, it was hammering against the windows of Sacred Heart like applause, like the universe clapping at something it had already decided. She stood at the window in the hallway outside Emma's room, watching the rain fall over Portland in the darkness. The city lights looked softer through the water, their edges blurred, their certainty compromised. For a moment she was back in Marjah. She was holding a different hand. She was watching a different life slip away between her fingers, and the sky above was the color of dust, not rain. The hospital hummed around her. The machinery continued its work. Somewhere in this building, a man was making phone calls, burning bridges, destroying a person he had only just met because that person had seen him clearly and had the audacity not to look away. Margaret didn't know what they would find when they called Portland General. But that wasn't the worst part. The alarms came first. 3 of them, stacked on top of each other like a cord no one wanted to hear. Margaret was checking vitals on a post-op patient when the code screamed through Sacred Heart's pediatric wing at 0217 hours. She knew that sound. She'd heard it in field hospitals under mortar fire, in tents where the heat made everything shimmer and sweat made bandages slip. Her body moved before her mind caught up. Emma's room. The child was supposed to be stable. Supposed to be healing. Margaret pushed through the crowd of residents clustered in the doorway, all of them frozen like deer caught in a crosshair's red dot. One of them was holding the chart. None of them was moving. The oxygen saturation monitor showed 68 and dropping. Emma's small face was the color of old pennies. Her breathing was labored, one-sided, the right side of her chest rising and falling wrong. Deviated trachea. Margaret could see it from the doorway, the soft tissue of the girl's neck pushed toward the left like someone had shoved her head sideways from the inside. Tension pneumothorax. Get me a 14-gauge angiocath needle. Now. Margaret's voice was flat, authoritative, the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. A resident scrambled. No one questioned her. That was the thing about certainty, it moved through a room like a tactical wedge through a checkpoint. Emma's father had held the highest rank in the Western military. He'd commanded men across 3 continents. But right now his daughter was suffocating and the only attending physician who could authorize treatment wasn't answering his phone. Margaret found the landmarks with her fingertips, second intercostal space, midclavicular line, her hand steady as surgical steel. The needle slid in with the precision of someone who'd done this exact procedure in a forward operating base under artillery fire, who'd felt the hiss of released pressure in places where helicopters couldn't land. The air came out. The hiss. Emma gasped, her oxygen saturation climbing. 82, 88. 92, the color returned to her small face like someone had switched a light back on inside her chest. Margaret stepped back. The residents moved forward. The crisis was contained. By 02:35 hours, Emma was stable and the general was walking through Sacred Heart's pediatric wing with the gait of a man accustomed to command, looking at his daughter with the kind of gratitude that nations are built on. Margaret was already in the corner, hand still steady, waiting for the next thing that needed fixing. The next thing came Monday morning at 0900 hours. The HR office was sterile in that institutional way, beige walls, fluorescent lights that hummed like insects, a desk with nothing on it except a manila folder and the end of everything Margaret had spent 2 weeks carefully constructing. The investigator sat across from her. He was thin, competent, the kind of professional who'd probably verified 1,000 employment histories and knew exactly what a paper trail should look like. Margaret's trail didn't match. There were gaps. Years of them. Hospitals with no records of her employment. References that led nowhere because the places they called had no record of her ever existing. Portland General. St. Jude, Seattle. The VA facility in Bethesda. All of them came back blank. All of them honest blanks, the kind you get when someone's 7 years of service was classified so deeply that even official channels had been instructed to deny it. Hargrove stood by the window. He wasn't surprised. He'd known exactly what he'd find when he made those calls, exactly what doors would close in his face, exactly what he'd have to work with instead. The absence of a paper trail was worth more than any paper trail. Absence was proof. We require verifiable employment history, Ms. Walsh. His voice was professional, regretful even, the tone of a man who'd done nothing wrong and was simply following protocol. Since you cannot provide it, your termination is effective immediately. Margaret's voice was quiet. I saved that child's life. With an unauthorized procedure. Hargrove turned from the window, and his eyes had the glitter of a man watching his gamble pay off. While the attending physician was unavailable. That's grounds enough. Hospital policy is clear. Unauthorized medical intervention, regardless of outcome, is cause for immediate dismissal. He was right. He was technically, absolutely, perfectly right. Margaret had performed an emergency procedure that she wasn't authorized to perform under circumstances that would make any board of directors nervous. That she'd saved a child's life was irrelevant to the legal machinery that would grind forward now. That the child would have died without her intervention was the kind of detail that defense attorneys use to get sympathetic juries, not the kind of detail that survives institutional protocol. Margaret stood. The investigator looked uncomfortable. Hargrove looked like a man who'd just successfully removed a splinter. Security arrived at 09 for 5 hours. Not aggressively. Not with drama. Just a guard Margaret recognized from the parking lot, someone's father probably, someone who signed up to walk people out when human resources said they had to. He held out a cardboard box like he was offering her a chance to put her dignity inside it. The locker held very little. A cracked mug with a faded anchor emblem that had survived 2 continents and 3 wars. A dying succulent that she'd been trying to nurse back to health for 6 months because some things just needed that much patience. And a photograph, 8 people in desert combat gear, posture perfect, faces younger than she was now. All of them dead. all of them officially never there. She wrapped the photo in paper towels and placed it carefully under the mug like it was something that could still break. At 1730 hours, Margaret stood at a bus stop on Southwest Alder Street, cardboard box growing soft in the rain, watching headlights blur into yellow smears through water. The rain in Portland was different than rain anywhere else. It came down like it had been waiting all year to arrive, and now it wasn't in any hurry to leave. It soaked through everything patiently. Relentlessly. Like water had all the time in the world, and your dry was negotiable. She'd been invisible for 7 years. Now she was unemployed. The irony was the kind that military people appreciated: dark, efficient, perfectly timed. The universe had a sense of humor about soldiers who couldn't stay invisible. But that wasn't the worst part. 2 weeks later, her phone rang. The number was Sacred Heart. The voice on the other end belonged to someone very high up, the kind of administrative voice that had authority layered into every syllable. The general, that voice explained, had personally requested her return. He'd made it clear that if Sacred Heart didn't reinstate her, he would be moving his daughter's care to another facility. He'd made it very clear. There had been phone calls. There had been implications. There were people who understood that upsetting a 4-star general's preferences was the kind of mistake that followed you through your entire career. Margaret reported Tuesday morning. Security escorted her directly to the pediatric wing. Not the HR office. Not the administrative entrance. Directly to the floor where Emma's room was waiting. The child was sitting up slightly now, color returned, the machinery of recovery humming around her. The general sat beside the bed, and when he saw Margaret, he stood with the formality of someone accustomed to ceremony. "Miss Walsh," he said. His voice was the voice that had commanded armies. "Thank you for coming back." That afternoon, a refugee patient arrived through the State Department asylum program. Margaret saw the intake order on the board: male, 47, former Taliban intelligence officer granted protection for cooperation with coalition forces. The kind of patient who was supposed to arrive at night, quietly, without fanfare. Instead, he arrived at 1430 hours on a Tuesday with escort vehicles and federal paperwork that meant he was someone's leverage. Margaret was assigned intake. Protocol was protocol. She entered the examination room with her chart and her steady hands and absolutely no expectation that the man on the examination table would take one look at her face and begin screaming in Pashto like his throat had become an air raid siren. The screaming was the kind that brought people running. Hospital security burst through the door. The man was pointing at her face, his words tumbling over each other in a language that sounded like gravel mixed with rage. Margaret caught pieces: Marjah, devil, the pass, brother, her own face going still in that particular way it did when information was being processed at the level where survival lived. "You." The word came in English now, desperate and precise. "The woman from Marjah." The devil medic who held the pass. Hargrove appeared in the doorway. His confusion was genuine. Margaret Walsh was the unemployed night nurse he'd successfully destroyed. She wasn't supposed to be anywhere. She definitely wasn't supposed to be standing in an intake room with a Taliban commander screaming her tactical call sign at top volume. Then the general was there. He moved slowly, deliberately, the way he'd learned to move at Emma's bedside, carefully, intentionally, a man in command of every molecule of his own presence. A SEAL team leader walked beside him. The team leader moved the way Margaret moved, the way only people trained at places officially off the map ever learned to move. With precision that looked like meditation. Emma's small voice came from behind them, from the wheelchair her father was still managing, senior chief. Margaret's hands began to tremble. Not from fear. From the recognition of something her body had been waiting for since she stood at that bus stop in the rain. She'd been waiting to be seen. Not suspected. Not recognized by accident. Seen. The general extended a folder. His voice was calm, measured, the voice of someone who'd just moved a chess piece that had been waiting in his hand for 2 weeks. "I made some calls after you saved my daughter's life," he said. Took presidential authorization, but these pages are finally declassified. Margaret's hand shook as she opened the folder. The documents inside were stamped in ways that meant they'd been buried and then deliberately unburied. The kind of paperwork that came from desks no one was supposed to know existed. She read her own history being handed back to her, 7 years that had been erased, suddenly official again. The SEAL team leader stepped forward. His voice carried down the hallway where Sacred Heart staff had begun to gather, pulling them toward a truth that was about to become impossible to deny. Senior Chief Petty Officer Margaret Walsh. Each word landed like a boot heel on tile. 2 Navy crosses. He paused. The reaction started before he continued. Staff members who'd dismissed her, who'd whispered about her incomplete credentials, who'd watched Hargrove destroy her like she was nothing. For Bronze Stars with Valor. Another pause. Longer this time. The weight of the decorations was settling. The woman who held the pass at Marjah for 16 hours when our extraction failed. An FBI agent in a dark suit moved through the crowd. His badge caught the fluorescent light. When he spoke, the hallway went so quiet you could hear the ventilators in the ICU 3 floors away. Operation Nightingale. 73 Allied lives saved. Enemy intelligence network dismantled. Senior Chief Walsh was ordered into classified cover status when the operation was buried for diplomatic reasons. Everything in her file was erased to protect ongoing operations. That wasn't negligence, Doctor. He turned to look directly at Hargrove. That was intentional oversight at the highest levels of government. Hargrove's mouth opened. Nothing came out. The machinery of institutional authority that he'd wielded so effectively against a lone night nurse suddenly reversed direction. The systems he'd activated, the calls to board members, the investigator, the carefully documented termination, all of it was suddenly standing him in front of a room full of people who now understood what Margaret Walsh actually was. The general's voice cut through the silence. She saved my daughter because saving people is who she is. Not what she does. Who she is. Margaret stood in that hallway, hand steady again, reading the documents that made her official again, and understood something she'd known since 02:17 hours on Saturday morning. Some things don't need authorization. The 72 hours moved like a blade through skin. Clean. Efficient. Surgical. Hargrove had made 3 phone calls, board members with names that sounded like trust funds, people who owed him surgical favors from 1,000 small compromises over 15 years. Verifiable employment history. That was the language. That was the knife. Margaret understood immediately. Her previous positions didn't exist on any official record because those positions had never officially existed. Fort Bragg doesn't list classified operators in hospital directories. Combat medics don't file W-2s for black sites. The paperwork of her life was buried deeper than any grave, and Hargrove knew it. She sat in the HR office on Tuesday morning with a woman named Patricia who wouldn't meet her eyes. Patricia held a form like it weighed 500 pounds. "We've attempted to verify your employment at 3 prior facilities," Patricia said, her voice the texture of damp cardboard. "None of them have records of a Margaret Walsh in any nursing capacity." Margaret didn't argue. Arguing would require revealing things that weren't hers to reveal. "I understand," Margaret said. "Just 2 words." Patricia flinched as if those 2 words contained a threat. They didn't. But they might as well have. The termination box was cardboard, slightly crushed on one corner. Margaret placed her personal items inside with the precision of someone packing a rucksack for deployment. The cracked mug from the ER break room, someone had given it to her 3 months ago, back when people acknowledged she existed. The dying succulent from her locker shelf, leaves brown at the edges like burnt paper. And the photograph. For people in desert camo, dust coating their faces like ash, standing in front of a building that no longer appeared on any map. Her unit. All of them dead now. All of them officially never there. She looked at their faces for maybe 3 seconds. Then she folded the photo in half and placed it beneath the other items where she wouldn't have to see their eyes. The bus stop was on Morrison Street. Rain fell the way it falls in Portland, not aggressive, but patient, like it had all the time in the world to find every crack in your defenses. Margaret stood with the cardboard box against her ribs and watched the traffic move past like blood through veins, purposeful and indifferent. A woman with a stroller hurried by without looking. A businessman checked his phone. Nobody knew they were standing near someone who had held a mountain pass for 16 hours while rounds ate through the walls. Nobody knew her hands had steady other hands at the moment they stopped moving forever. Nobody knew anything. This was the trade-off of her life now, invisibility purchased with silence. Her phone rang at 2:02 p.m. on Wednesday. The general's voice came through like a command transmitted through encrypted channels. "Nurse Walsh, this is General Matthew Chen. My daughter asked for you this morning. When I told her you were no longer working at Sacred Heart, she cried. She hasn't cried in 8 months." Margaret said nothing. The silence was her language. "I'm calling their administration right now. You will be reinstated immediately. That is not a request. That is a direct order to people who depend on federal contracting." The line went dead. Sacred Heart called Thursday morning. "Come back. We were wrong." The words they used were different, but the meaning was the same. Someone with power had decided that she mattered. Margaret returned on Monday. 2 weeks. 14 days between irrelevance and restoration, though restoration was its own kind of lie. The combat boot stayed in her locker. Nothing had actually changed except that now people knew to be afraid of what they couldn't explain. The Taliban commander arrived on Margaret's second night back. His file said refugee, said asylum status, said he was no threat. But when Margaret came through the doorway to check his vitals, he went rigid like a man who'd just seen a ghost. His scream came in Pashto, ancient and animal, the sound of someone who'd watched his friends disappear into a building where a woman with steady hands and colder eyes had worked for 16 hours without stopping. "You! The woman from Marjah! The devil medic! The one who..." His voice broke. He was shaking. Margaret didn't move. She stood in the doorway like she was made of reinforced steel, her face revealing nothing, her hands perfectly still at her sides. Emma's small voice cut through his screaming. "Senior Chief." The general's daughter sat in her wheelchair with her hand extended. One word. That was all it took. "Senior Chief." Not nurse. "Senior Chief." The title landed like a classified file suddenly declassified, suddenly real, suddenly witnessed. The general stood in the hallway with a manila folder thick enough to hold a life. He extended it to Margaret without preamble. She opened it and read the words that made her official again: Navy Cross, November 2011. Navy Cross, March 2012. Bronze Star. Bronze Star. Bronze Star. Bronze Star. Each medal was a brick. Each medal was real. Each medal was something she'd never told anyone, something that existed only in her hands now, something that proved she'd been more than a nurse, more than invisible, more than a woman at a bus stop with a dying succulent. A SEAL team leader stepped forward. His chest carried the weight of decorations like a man carries water. "Operation Nightingale," he said. 73 Allied lives extracted. Enemy intelligence network dismantled. 16 hours. Single operator. That's the official declassification. His eyes held Margaret's with a kind of respect that only comes between people who've stood in the fire together. He raised his hand. A salute. The fist against the chest that meant everything to people who understood the language of sacrifice. The FBI agent stood beside him. He was younger than Margaret expected, maybe 35, with a kind of face that had never doubted anything. "We've been reviewing Sacred Heart's billing records," he said, and his attention pivoted toward Hargrove like a laser finding its target. "Your treatment protocols for Emma Walsh show 17 procedures that were never administered. Experimental treatments that don't exist in any medical literature." His voice had the texture of evidence, of documentation, of things that could not be unsaid. "The billing exceeds $487,000. Richard Chen from the board stepped forward. Chen was a man who understood power, which meant he understood when power was shifting. When the general made inquiries about Nurse Walsh's reinstatement, we conducted an audit, he said. His voice was precise. Clinical. Dr. Hargrove, you've systematically overcharged this family for treatments that were never provided to their daughter. While this woman was saving lives under fire in Afghanistan, you were building a second home with insurance fraud. Hargrove's mouth opened. Closed. Opened again like a fish pulled from water. His hands had begun to shake, not the controlled tremor of someone managing crisis, but the uncontrolled shaking of someone experiencing the moment the ground becomes liquid. That's a misunderstanding of the coding system, he said, and his voice had become small, which meant his power had become small, which meant the room now belonged to someone else. The treatments were. The general's voice cut him off. It was the voice of someone accustomed to being heard, of someone who had commanded thousands, of someone who didn't raise his voice because he didn't need to. You let my daughter deteriorate. You performed procedures she didn't need and charged for procedures that didn't happen. While this woman was working in forward operating bases under fire, you were stealing from her care. From a child's care. Hospital security entered. The same guard who had handed Margaret her termination box 2 weeks ago now held another one out to Hargrove. The symmetry was almost elegant. I believe you know the way out, sir, the guard said. His voice held no anger, no satisfaction. Just the simple logistics of removal. Hargrove took the box with hands that looked like they'd never held anything heavier. He tried to speak. You can't do this, I have contracts, I have. The FBI agent took a step closer. You have the right to remain silent. They walked him out past the staff he had once commanded with a single glance. Past the nurses who had learned to fear his presence like dogs learn to fear certain footsteps. Past Margaret, who stood with the kind of quiet dignity that only comes from having already survived the worst things human beings can do to each other. The ranger medic who'd recognized her suture technique months ago and said nothing, he stepped forward as Hargrove passed. His hand rose. A salute. Not to Hargrove. To Margaret. Margaret's hand came up in return, and tears were on her cheeks now, which meant she'd finally given herself permission to feel something other than tactical assessment. Emma wheeled herself forward and reached for Margaret's hand. The child's grip was strong. The child's grip meant everything. The general's voice was thick with the kind of emotion that comes from watching your daughter reach toward someone who'd refused to quit. She told me you were different from the others. She didn't know why. Now I do. 6 months later, Margaret adjusted Emma's hand braces in the physical therapy room at Sacred Heart. The child took 3 careful steps with the walker, her legs shaking but holding weight they weren't supposed to hold again. That's for more than yesterday, sweetheart. Emma's smile was the kind of smile that made everything make sense. Because you didn't give up. Margaret had been promoted. Clinical nurse specialist. She overseen the pediatric wing now. The combat boot stayed in her locker, but the Navy chief anchor pin was visible on her lanyard. Emma took another step, wobbled, and Margaret steadied her with hands that knew exactly what steadiness meant. Heroes walk among us. Sometimes in scrubs, saving lives in the dark. If you've ever hidden who you really were to survive, like Margaret did, subscribe. If you've seen a quiet person suddenly become unstoppable, leave a comment. And if you believe we need to recognize the hidden warriors in our hospitals and emergency rooms, share this story.